with him since I think all of you are very well introduced, and because he is president of Academy of Social Sciences of the Royal Society of Canada, professor at the Department for Political Sciences in University Quebec in Montreal, in Canada, and head of Cathedra for Canada and Quebec Studies. He is working on minority nations in federal states more than 30 years. And he is one of the highest authorities for Quebec, Scotland, and Catalonia as minority nations within their federal states. He's a politologist, political scientist, and comparative scientist of Quebec, theoretician of federalism and nationalism. And his researches are related to and deeply deeply influenced academic and public discourse in Quebec and entire Canada, and as well as his comparative work with Scotland and Catalonia. Professor Gagnon's recent publications include Multinational Federalism, Challenges, Shortcomings, and Promises in Regional and Federal States Studies, 2020, this year, Majority State Nationalism and New Research Pathways in Nationalism and Ethnic Politics, Federalism and National Diversity in the 21st Century with Professor Tremblay, and last year, 2019, Federalism Secession with Jorge Cajaui Conde. I hope I did not make so huge mistake with the pronouncement. I would like to, because we lost 20 minutes, I would like to give the floor to our first introducer and promoter of Professor Gagnon's book, but we failed to agree our table. Do you agree, Professor Gagnon? Would you like to be first or in the middle or last? It's up to you to decide.
Well,
we invited our... Yeah.
My preference would be to be the last one to intervene, so that I see how my colleagues look at the book, and hopefully they will criticize me so that I can bounce back.
All right. Then, Mr. Tremblay, would you like to be the first one? So then can speak our friend and colleague, Professor Barbarić, and then Professor Vanjek. Is it all right for you?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, Professor Tremblay from University of Regina in Canada, floor is yours. Let's say 10 to 15 minutes, because we already lost a quarter of hour.
I thank you. I don't think my comments will take 10 to 15 minutes. They'll actually be, I think, quite short. So I'm happy to let my other colleagues speak a little bit longer. So my involvement with this book is much longer than people might actually think. So I was when I was just completing my doctoral studies. Just to give everybody a little bit of context, I was graciously invited by Professor Gagnon to do research at his research chair in Montreal, as I was completing my PhD at the University of Toronto. And when I was there, Professor Gagnon had the idea of translating minority nations in the age of uncertainty from French to English. And as is Professor Gagnon, as anyone knows him, he's a great mentor to younger students, and one who provides them with unique opportunities to really shine. And he brought me into this project and to help him translate it from French to English. So I have an intimate knowledge of this project from its beginning. And for better or worse, I was involved in its translation. So if there are any issues that you have with it, please feel free to blame me. What I must say is, within that context, so to give you a little bit of my perspective on it, I was approaching this book as somebody who studies multiculturalism and the recognition and accommodation of cultural and ethnic minorities born out of migration and immigration. So I'm not initially a student of federalism or multinational federations or minority nations. Over the last decade, through my involvement with Professor Gagnon, I have been able to join my research agenda with his. And within that context, what I want to do is really highlight one thing that I think is absolutely critical in this book, and that is a major contribution, a unique and major contribution to the study of minority nations, and which is setting the research agenda for the study, for a facet of the study of minority nations moving forward. And that, so there's a lot of interesting stuff in the book leading up to it, but for me, the conclusion is really what stands out. And that's what I'd like to kind of highlight just in a kind of a few short minutes. And what I think is the book's absolutely vital contribution to the study of minority nations moving forward. And what's unique about it is it looks at both the external and internal dimensions of minority nations in terms of the recognition of diversity. And so within the conclusion, Professor Gagnon establishes this triptych of ways of empowering, emancipating, and recognizing minority nation. And as part of this triptych, two parts of it relate to the external dimension, what I would call the external dimension of minority nations, and the relation between the minority nation and majority nations. The third part of the triptych, and this is really, I think, what is the innovative part, is bringing all of these together, it looks at the internal dimension of minority nations. And so what Professor Gagnon does at that point is highlights three principles as part of these triptychs that are, if embraced and empowered, will lead to, as the book's title calls it, a new path to a national emancipation and empowerment. So if these principles are recognized, and if the real partners in any multinational state recognize these, this provides the real path. So along the external dimension, the two important principles are those of moderation and dignity. And what that really suggests at that point is that this is something, these principles are ones that both the minority nation and the majority nation can agree on, but it's part of their relationship. It has to be a relationship based on moderation or restraint from the majority nation in relation to the minority nation. And it has to be one where both partners have their own dignity, and that dignity is respected. So that's the external dimension. But what Alain Gagnon does really uniquely is bridges that with this internal dimension, and that of hospitality. So what he's doing is situating minority nations, or, you know, within this context, and I think Professor Gagnon would agree with this, is kind of two cases that he's looking at primarily within this book, Spain and Canada, or Catalonia and Quebec. And really within that context, what he does is he brings up this idea of interculturalism as being a way of embodying the principle of hospitality. And he's situating minority nations really within the age of migration and the age of immigration. And I think for me, that is what the book culminates, and what it leads to, really leads to that story. And I think that's an essential story moving forward. If I, as I say, I have a kind of a vested interest in this book and a self-interest too. It's something that I've been involved with in several stages, and this conclusion has also been critical for setting the collaborative agenda that Professor Gagnon and I have been developing, and most recently in our volume Federalism and I forgot what it's called, Federalism and National Diversity in the 21st Century. So this is kind of what it does, and I think that if to maybe kind of conclude, I said I wasn't going to take 5 or 10 minutes. I'm taking 5 or 10 minutes. So really, what to kind of conclude at that point is, I think that is the for me in my almost decade-long involvement in this book. For me, the critical contribution that really stands out, and that has been absolutely essential in setting a research agenda forward. So my question, if there's anything for Professor Gagnon, and I say this out of kind of almost self-interest too, is what is the next step afterwards? And also within the context of interculturalism, that word itself, that interculturalism over the years, as about embodying this internal dimension of hospitality, interculturalism has become an increasingly complex and contested term. And I guess my question to Professor Gagnon would be, is what kind of interculturalism for that internal dimension is perhaps best suited now to really bring out this principle of hospitality? Or is there something else than interculturalism that is really needed to evoke this principle within a minority nation of hospitality to migrants and immigrants? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tremblay. Professor Gagnon, would you like to answer Professor Tremblay's question now, or you will use your last word to answer the question?
Well, I would prefer to hear what my other colleagues have to say, although I did appreciate very much what Arjun comments on the book. I like to take I like to step back for a while.
All right. In that case, I will give the floor to our colleague Dražen Barbarić, head of studies of political science at the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Mostar. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Milan. First of all, it is a great pleasure, and really I'm honored to participate in this kind of event, to be one of presenters of translation of the book of Professor Gagnon. I would try to be a bit more descriptive because of participants and our guests at this promotion. And in the last part of my presentation, I would like to make some points or my personal observation how this kind of book and also theories and specific models and political practices that you were mentioning in this book, how they can influence in the context of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a genuine multicultural and multinational society and state. So the translation of book of Professor Gagnon really represents the enormous contribution to the academic consideration of multinational states, and of course the federal models of their territorial and also political organization. From our perspective in Bosnia and Herzegovina, mainstream political science literature is more than deficient and poor with the thematization of federalism as such, and also a comparative observation of much older democratic multinational states and their federal models. So, of course, that this book opens the rich tradition of theories and models of federalism in the Western democratic world. Also, in our mainstream political science circles, it seems that almost our society is not multinational or multicultural at all, and therefore federal models are there is no need, or they seem to perceived as unnecessary in the media, and of course in the academic sphere, in the mainstream political science, in the mainstream media of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So the whole process of flourishing debates and theories within federal states just flowed past us without serious acknowledgement of their existence. So we live in the divided society where the taboo of the F word is a mainstream perspective, unfortunately, in academic, media, but also in political sphere. So anyone who dares to promote or even pledge any kind of federalist model can easily get label of nationalist, Stalinist, or even a fascist, believe it or not. So translation of this book is an extremely important step to abandon this mainstream taboo and to put federalism on the mainstream agenda as a democratic and legitimate model of resolving political problems of our multinational society. Professor Gagnon starts from the in the book starts from the contemporary context in which minority nations seeks for a model of preservation of their political subjectivity. And most common element of mentioned context is the globalization pressures that decreases the cultural and political significance of the minority nation. So also with the excuse of the importance of efficiency of central state administration, and that only central state administration can handle those globalization pressures. From that perspective, cultural diversity, especially multilingualism, became obstacle for the functionality of the state, and the public funds for the preservation of the multilingualism and cultural diversity became unnecessary expense. So we have similar arguments within Bosnia and Herzegovina, when some of the intellectuals claim that our society is monocultural, and there are no needs for the treatment of society as the multicultural. Of course, political repercussions of those arguments are mostly implicit and hidden, and one of the tendency which was underlined in this book is that supporting federalist model is reducing sensibility of international organization for collective rights of minority nations. Central governments and majority nations abuse this tendency, and they use it for reducing minority rights or even to neglect their interests or requirements. Majority nations legitimize those neglection through the concept of individual rights for all citizens without recognizing possibilities of collective rights for minority nations. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, this concept is completely perverted for the process of desubjectivization of minority nation and for establishment of majority political hegemony. Also, Professor Gagnon recognized these processes on the wider international level, describing it as a seductive version of Jacobinian state model, which offers ideal type of society without minority nations and therefore without necessity for applying federal models at all. But on the contrary, Professor Gagnon pledged for the multinational federalism, which balances between stability of the state on the one hand and functionality of political system, and on the other side on some sort of political autonomy for the minority nation. That model would increase commitment of minority nation to a common state, but also international prestige of the common state in whole. To create that kind of functional federal state, it isn't enough just to apply some sort of institutional model of federalism and put it in the local context, but also Professor underlined that we need in multinational state, we need to develop federal political culture. That process is a thorny path to establish overlapping federal culture that will be legitimized by majority and also minority nation within same state. Federal culture does not approve mechanisms of political exclusion or the illusion of citizen state without any national differences. Without it, political systems in multinational states will result in non-democratic practices, hegemony of majority nation, and the secessionist tendencies within minority nations. Professor writes that possibility of enforcing amendments or laws from the perspective of one nation or federal entity to another one is a pure example of non-democratic federation. Not just that we have this possibility in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but we also have mechanisms of political domination through which majority nation is constantly electing and delegating member of presidency at the state level of Croatian president, member of Croatian president to a state level, and also MPs to a House of Peoples on the federal political level. Using two theoretical concepts, one is positive freedom from the famous theoretician Isaiah Berlin, and also concept of non-dominance of Philippe T. Professor Gagnon is trying to introduce a model of positive autonomy, which doesn't stop on the mechanisms of negative freedom, which means restraining central government to derogate jurisdictions of federal entities, but it shifts on the needs for empowerment of minority nation, which is one of the central arguments, theoretical arguments of this book. Minority nations need to become political subjects of their own strategic development and self-determination without tutorship of central government and majority nation. So the empowerment of minority nation within concept of positive autonomy can result with good governance on sub-state level, but also with the increasement of the commitment of minority nation to a common state. Referring to insights of Arndt Leibhardt, professor criticized Unitarian tendencies as potentially dangerous. First of all, they cannot achieve creation of cohesive society and functional state. Just on the contrary, they will just create counter-reaction in the sense of increasing cohesion, but within minority nations. And of course, with reducing state cohesion and inducing some sort of political or even identity tensions between national communities, which mean majority and minority nations. And one of the most interesting concepts in this book is that this is about state-nation. It's supposed to be ethnically homogeneous and above 50% of the whole population. And Professor Gagnon claims that self-confidence of that state-nation, which means majority nation, increases the level of their willingness to concessions toward minority nation, which is a rather interesting argument in the book. Minority nations doesn't like to beg or to be subordinated, but to become equal partner to majority nation on political level. And federal culture in that sense means absolute abandon of majoritarian hegemony and creating principle of partnership. So the concept of citizenship must include diverse level citizens in the identification and definitely must preserve individual rights. Contrary-wise, the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where citizenship concept is just a camouflage for the majoritarian hegemony, genuine federal culture must be based on citizenship that is woven on the, I quote Professor, plurinationality that recognizes and celebrates deep differences, end of quote. So what are the key lessons of this book for our country, for Bosnia and Herzegovina? First of all, arguments and theses in this book are basically inexhaustible and extremely valuable from the perspective of academic sphere, but also in probably as a political argument in media and also in political system. They gave us a theoretical pool and numerous of practical examples of federalism in the democratic societies as a tool for resolving political gaps between majority and minority nations. A basic ground for every federal state is a general agreement. Sovereignty and legitimacy of the states depend directly on compliance of it. But on the other hand, loyalty of minority nation is just proportional to recognition of its political identity and empowerment. Above mentioned general agreement puts the majority and minority nation in the level of partnership, in the status of equal partners, with the perpetual need for international dialogue and establishing the mutual trust. Without honest trust, openness of central government, and creation of federal culture, multinational societies just remain only on the level of non-democratic federal hegemonies of majority nation. I quote Professor Gagnon, "The renovation of democracy will not come from a passion for consensus, but from the culture of reasonable disagreement. Democracy is impossible without some consensus, but it must also allow the expression of differences and the makeup of collective identities of differentiated positions, end of quote. Therefore, we always must take care of the fact that multinational federalism is open and contingent process, but necessary if we want to create stable and democratic multinational society. So the translation of this book is the valuable beginning of creation of federal culture in the academic sphere in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much to Professor Barbarić for his inspiring and wide presentation of Professor Gagnon's book. And now I will give the floor to Mr. Dejan Vanjek, who is also professor at the University of Mostar, and he is the president of the Association for Promotion of the Philosophy of Federalism. Mr. Vanjek, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Milan. I would like to express warm welcome and greetings to Professor Gagnon, also to Professor Tremblay for giving us wonderful intro. Professor Gagnon, we had plans for you to come earlier this year to join a big conference that we were about to organize with the University in Mostar. But due to the pandemics, we have postponed, as you well know, this event for a few times. And since the pandemic was very persistent, we have decided to use the means of a Google Meet platform and to finally realize these plans. Especially because we had, with the assistance of and support of the university, we had printed a certain number of samples of the book translated in Croatian language. I'm not sure, but it might be the first book of that sort, which is actually translated in Croatian, maybe in other regional languages here. It appears that what colleague Barbarić said, there is this sense of federalism being this F word. And not only that, it appears that federalism implies some aspects which are not very popular even in the international law when we speak about self-determination principle, which is firm a pillar of international law, but there is tendency in multilateral organizations to cite that principle and not to give it some proper weight. We know that that's not by accident, and it's also interesting that academic interest in countries like Canada for explaining and promoting these principles within the general federal doctrine is well underway. We here in, for instance, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is federal country, easily could know nothing about it because that's obviously not mainstream. So that's why we rely to the associative dimension, forming associations, trying to connect, trying to get to the source of knowledge. And I truly believe this book is such a source of knowledge for us, because while I was reading it, I have met so many analogies. First of all, I have introduced myself to the whole new level and register of terms, federalist terms. Some of them are innovative, which, for instance, informal constitution, interculturalism as a specific approach to the Quebec, which obviously is practically on the way and still develops as a doctrine vis-a-vis broader approach of multiculturalism, which is by now even more established within the so to say rest of Canada. So there are different ways how you address tensions within your societies, but none of these things, none of the progress which you had wouldn't happen if there wasn't activism, specifically within the Quebec society. Its power to master these ideas to support sound academic projects, which enable us to understand, to work our way in bridging these prejudices and getting closer the ideas of unity and diversity, because that's I think the main goal of Federalist project, not to sacrifice diversity for the sake of unity, but to keep both dimensions well and in healthy condition, to keep political communities, but not to allow any diminishing or not at the expense of the constituent nations, units, not at the expense of their dignity. So from that point, I really believe this book is very generally very good, and for us in Bosnia and Herzegovina is unique of this kind, especially because of these new concepts, because we don't have a sound political system in terms of a productive constitutional dialogue. Our constitutionalism is very weak. Actually, we have strongly entrenched constitutional principle of constituency, which implies equal rights of the three constituent people in our constitution. But these norms are not effectuated on the practical level. So to say, institutions are not well set in a way to respect these constitutional values. So what happens is that the constitution is nominally supporting equality of all three constituent peoples, and in practice you meet different kinds of manipulations which are defended and advocated in the public space, contrary to what the federal constitutional principles enshrined in the BH Constitution would suggest. So it's a paradoxical situation. We have a very visible, very recognizable elements of federalism in our constitution, but in practice, we can't say we have any trace of federalism. We don't have a constitutional process visible. In Canada, I would say, reading your book, I would say you can track this federalism is present, especially and things start developed after patriation of Constitution 1982. I would say that the fact that the Quebec's concerns were not taken into account at that time were directing further developments. There were certain attempts which failed to upgrade, to renew constitutional deal, which will favor all sides in Canada. Those initiatives were not successful, but still they influenced the public dynamics in Canada. It's sort of dialectics. You had this referendum on secession, but in the end you had also the reference on secession, which had upgraded your constitutional system and brought forth four very important principles of democracy, federalism, rule of law, and constitutionalism, and protection of minority rights into fora. No, I can't see that no one is questioning these principles in Canada. So the framework is set. There are tensions as in any other federation. In Bosnia and Herzegovina is opposite sides. The principles are preset, but there's a huge divergence among three people how to interpret these principles. So the tension is even more visible, and I'm not sure how this situation can be actually surpassed when it comes to Bosnia and Herzegovina. So there's no visible process. There are no stages. We are currently in the vacuum because nothing is in that respect. Every failure we had in the constitutional negotiations was buried where it stands. So nothing positive was derived from those attempts to work and to support in further discussions. I suggest what you also mentioned in your work, that the federal culture and democratic tradition is also something at play. It's very important. And what was also very interesting to me is that each community, minority community, which seeks recognition, must set its claims within the limits of the liberal democratic doctrine, which means that it must uphold democracy, uphold the rule of law, and especially must be susceptible to the minorities in its own realm, so that this principle of non-domination would be really lived by and would be supported in practical life. This kind of behavior, this kind of political action gives you all the legitimacy that is required from the point of view of liberal public opinion. And this very much facilitates the positive reaction and progress in terms of further accommodation of Quebec's position within Canada. I wouldn't be too optimistic there. I notice you have also some skepticism. I would like to also hear about it. There are some analogies as well, because there's this majoritarian reflex. Dominant political elites in your country also dictate agenda. I would like to know, in as much now the Quebec as a political subject can actually participate in setting the rules of the game, which is what the autonomy is all about. And yeah, I'm looking forward to your presentation, and hope we can make in the closure some further analogies from both sides and have interaction to expand these ideas and maybe have some new. Thank you very much, please.
Thank you, Mr. Vanjek. And finally, Professor Gagnon, floor is yours as the author of the book. Now you have all the inputs of your colleagues, so you have opportunity to sum up and to present the essence of your book.
Well, thank you very much, my colleague Milan Sitarski. I want to take advantage of this occasion to thank everyone who has translated my work. Arjun first, who brought it to the English audience, and also, well, obviously for the Croatian language, the work of Dejan Vanjek, Dražen Barbarić, Mate Penava, I understand, has been involved, Hugo Vlaslavjevic, I've been involved in this work, so thank you very much in bringing my work to your community. This is with a lot of pride, obviously. I mean, this is the book has now been translated into 22 languages, so I'm very proud of it. It means that it has a resonance in different countries, in different situations across the world. So this is part 2 of a series of 3 volumes. The volume 1 dealt with the all-encompassing nation that I'm very critical of, and I was imagining a different future for many countries, among which Spain, for instance, where I felt that they needed to have less of an encompassing nation and more of a multinational context. The same thing applies also, obviously, in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the multinational dimension ought to be taken seriously by political leaders, and also in Canada. Although I am a strong promoter of the multinational context and concept, it doesn't mean that all Canadians are supportive of the notion. There's some important opposition to it. There's a lot of people who sustain and defend and stand behind the territorial federalism that stress the equal citizenship, the idea that all individuals were created the same and equal in front of the law. But at the same time, we know that if everyone is treated the same, depending on the condition on which they live, the result would be different, because the condition of existence, the possibility for someone to achieve politically, sociologically, are quite distinct. So this is why I think that the multinational concept is a notion that needs to be given much more credit than it has had. So first, let me stress perhaps the users of the F words that has not been pronounced by, people are afraid of pronouncing it. So what is it used for? First, it is used for managing, not resolving, but managing political conflict. It doesn't mean that at the end of the day, everyone will be happy with it, but at least if we have options from which to imagine a better future, federalism then is a useful tool to have. The second use of federalism is to be able to act as a shield for minorities. And here, either Quebec or Aboriginal people, or in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the situation of the Croat obviously is an important situation. And these minority groups, minority nation, needs to be provided the sufficient tools from which they can aspire to have a fair and equal future to the other residents of the state itself. So it's not to have a set of privileges, but it's to have the same potential for economic, social, and institutional advancement. So federalism, therefore, is a crucial instrument that ought to be taken care of. The third element of federalism is to find a balance between the centripetal and the centrifugal forces of a regime. So we need to, as Arjun mentioned, we need the concept of moderation, which is very present in my work. So we need to therefore to value both centripetal but also centrifugal forces. So the communities, either the Croat or the Serbs, have different needs. So some will prefer perhaps more centralized institution, but I will believe that the Croat will want to have more decentralized institution for their own specific needs. And this has to be not discouraged, but this has to be not only tolerated, but encouraged and accepted as a fact of life. The fourth element is the fact that federalism contributes to provide and create the condition of innovation on the part of communities. So all of these minority nations ought to become host society in and of themselves, so that they can be hospitable to others and welcome others in their own political community. And third is the idea of representation. To what extent will minority nations be able to represent their communities, not only within the state, but also at the international level, and project a very, very forceful voice internationally. So it's not to be contained within a given nation state, but it's to be allowed to be able to have a key role at the international level. It was mentioned that I, as a Quebecer, obviously, when I promote the notion of multinational federalism, I'm not necessarily always popular with this, because there is also in Quebec a strong movement in favor of independence. So even the word of independence still has some power to mobilize group, but at the same time, what I think is quite essential, even if two referendums have been lost or defeated, the referendum on secession, it remains that the only solution left is to be able to invest onto this multinational project, so that we can develop a form of trust between members of the Canadian communities. It's not a blind trust. So my multinational federation is not about a blind trust. It is a conditional trust, So Quebecers will be in a position to trust their federal partners to the extent that they have the leeway, they have the potential to assert themselves, to project themselves internationally, and to also integrate within their own community people coming from different places in the world. So here the potential of interculturalism is a strong element to be able to rally energy and forces. So in some words, in fewer words, we need to feed the federal spirit. How do we do it? The federal spirit needs to be built on some key pillars, some key operational principles. One of them is trust. Another one is the idea that the reciprocity argument that I'm raising throughout the book. The other one is about the continuity, which for me is an essential principle. And probably the continuity is the one that trumps the other one. We need to be able to find a way by which community can be able to reproduce themselves and have a good and important future. In the case of Quebec, Quebec also has a multinational platform to operate from, because we have in Quebec 11 Aboriginal nations. So what do we do with the 11 Aboriginal nations? We need to try to find a way by which they have a secure future. They are capable of earning a decent living, because they have obviously the occupied part of the north segment of the Quebec territory. So there's a lot of resources there, and these resources, they are the first and foremost owner of these resources. So we need to find a way by which we can trust each other. And even if Aboriginal community in Quebec form 1% of the population, they need to have also the potential to develop themselves and to have a decent future by maintaining their languages and develop their own community. So if multinational federalism applies at the pan-Canadian level, it also applies within the member unit of the country. I wish in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, they could pay more attention to the reference case, the 1998 reference case, because this is probably one of the most interesting and important ruling on the part of a court throughout the world that brings forward the full notion that Dejan was raising, the notion, the principle, the democratic principle, the federal principle, the rule of law and constitutionalism, and also the protection of minority rights. Now, these principles need to be taken together, not one at the expense of the other, but they need to be taken together. And they are quite crucial, I guess, for the maintenance of peaceful relation and respectful relation between Canadian and Canada has a very highly developed culture, democratic culture, but for countries where the democratic culture is not as, I would say, developed or affirmed, people, particularly people from the minority nation, need to be able to raise the Supreme Court ruling of 1998 as a reference for the world to pay attention to. And I would suggest that the Croat in particular, since they form, I understand, 15% of the population within the Bosnia and Herzegovina, I think they have there some potential instrument from which to be able to defend their own rights, to project themselves and to self-realize themselves and to emancipate themselves through a variety of empowerment strategies. Perhaps I should raise some other points in terms of what the international community has to say with respect to the rights of community and individual rights. So in the early 1990s, the international communities were very, very forceful lay behind minority nations. I remember looking at the declaration of the Copenhagen Declaration that established in 1990 the principle of territorial autonomy. This was, in fact, a major declaration because it stressed the protection and promotion of identities of minority nations. This is one of the most important declarations that had been made. Following this declaration of 1990, then the international community started to shy away from collective and community rights. But again, as a Quebecer or as a member of close to Aboriginal claims, I think that this Copenhagen Declaration is one of the key references to be referring to stand up behind the rights of minorities. What followed thereafter were the series of declarations, but most of them, perhaps with the exception of the 1996 the Hague Declaration on the rights of national minorities to education, but most of the following declarations were about the rights of members of national minorities as individual, not as member of a community. And I think there the international community has started to abandon, is too strong of a term, but to neglect minority nation as minority nation. So follow the Lund Declaration with respect to the participation in public life. We had also the utilization of minority rights, minority languages with respect to radio, televisions. Followed the 2006 statement with respect to the police. We also had the 208 declaration, the Bolzano-Bolzan Declaration in sub-state negotiation. And probably there was a better declaration in 2012 with the Ljubljana, where they had there a statement about the integration within communities that were marked by diversity. So the Ljubljana guideline is probably one that is most useful now for the case that the Bosniak in particular are going through in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and more recently the Graz recommendation on minority nation and the access to justice is also another declaration at the international level that is quite useful to look at. And perhaps most recently, although this was not yet a declaration, I was involved with the group in Bilbao and Barcelona that held a conference a couple of weeks ago about what should be the guidelines, the new guidelines to support the right for communities to self-determination, internal self-determination, or potentially external self-determination. Now, these notions seems to be very perhaps away from what is imagined in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but at the same time, we need to think ahead of time, ahead of tough issues. So the right of self-determination ought to be a right that ought to be present in any constitution, so that the trust, the conditional trust, is maintained. I stress at the very beginning that I'm not an adept of blind trust. I'm an adept of conditional trust. And conditional trust by minority nation will be given to the extent that the minority nation have the potential to project themselves, to self-realize themselves, and to empower themselves and their communities. And to the extent that this is being done, trust and mutual trust will result of the negotiation between the member units. So we need to be aware that individual rights is a nice, very great notion to to stand for, but there's no one that says that it has to be done at the supra-state level. First, individual rights need to be accomplished at the sub-state level or within the multinational context. That ought to be done within the nation that will form the multinational federation itself. The more we go at the higher level, the more the minority rights will be neglected, and this is why I speak of hospitality and to defend minority rights first and foremost within the nation itself, and then within the multinational framework. We should not simply develop the cosmopolitan idea is a nice idea, but we need to be able to implement rights and protection of rights first at the level of the community and then at the level of the supranational level. So, so in terms of the comments that were made by Vanjek, well, I agree with him that the F word is not a very popular word, even if I stand behind the multinational federalism concept. It remains that there's a lot that comes with it, but therefore we need to take the best out of this concept. One of the best is probably the idea of abeyances. That is, there are rights which exist that are not spoken for, that have not been constitutionalized, but they have been practiced. There's a practice of recognition that we need to pay attention to. There's also the notion that Arjun has flagged, the idea of active citizenship that ought to be present. And I think if we are able to maintain an active citizenship and encourage members of different communities within the subnational unit, I think we'll make some real progress. In terms of the comments, in fact, many comments that were made by Dražen Barbarić, who obviously has fully understood, like Dejan Vanjek, the book and the purpose of the book. I really like the way that you summarized it, and the way that the democratic advancement has been put forward, the way that you also see the association between loyalty and trust and empowerment. I mean, those are all, in fact, they are all together. This loyalty, trust, and empowerment. You will be loyal to the overall state to the extent that your community is empowered. And to the extent your community is empowered, you will trust the other. And then obviously you will develop a mutual trust feeling toward the other communities. But if you're not able to empower your community, how could you be loyal to the overall community? How can you trust the overall community? So empowerment is definitely the most important ingredient so that you will achieve the trust, you will achieve the loyalty. So obviously you understand that I'm entirely against assumed blind trust. I think this is not definitely the way to go. In particular, where there's been a situation where rivalry and violence had taken place. We need to rebuild from the bottom, and to rebuild from the bottom is to give the community the potential to self-realize themselves the best possible way. So obviously, no to subordination, no to domination. The way that power is structured is not about a zero-sum game. For me, it's about a positive sum game. It's not because you allow community to self-realize themselves that the majority nation is losing anything. And then with respect to Arjun, obviously Arjun knows quite well my work, and I'm currently working on the third part of my of my 3-part volume. So I'll have to discuss with him potentially how he can contribute to make it better known to the world. In fact, the book is about, it's called The Clash of Legitimacies. And I guess having read what you read in Minority Nation, you would understand that for me, both the minority nation and the majority nation have full legitimacy to act. They have the majority nation obviously has stronger power to find a process of legitimization because of their strength, because of the number. But at the same time, it doesn't mean because you have the number on your side, the number that is the larger community, that you have more rights to self-determine themselves than the other group. So the clash of legitimacy is the next on the route, and I am just finishing the last. I'm currently working on the conclusion. It will be released in French at the end of the summer, I understand, by Boreal, which is the Montreal publishing house. And then I'll have to work with my colleague in different quarters to see how interested they are in releasing it in their respective languages. So on this, I definitely wish to thank you for all the work you've done on this. And hopefully, if there are different specific questions with respect to what I've just said, possibly with respect to the international community, I'm obviously open to discuss them with you. And I promise to visit Mostar sometime down the road when we have finally gotten rid of this awful virus. And who knows, perhaps go to Sarajevo and visit other communities so that I can share some of my thoughts more immediately with colleagues who have taken the time to make this work available at a larger audience. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor. At first, I will ask all of you, all participants, would anybody like to comment something, to add something, to ask our participants, our promoters? Yeah, Dražen? All right.
Can I ask?
Professor, one short question. First of all, thank you for your presentation and for clarification of some theses and arguments in this book. I would like to ask you about concept of federal culture. It's crystal clear to all of us that position of minority nation by its structure, but phenomenologically, when we took the position of minority, they are much more keen, naturally, to develop and accept and be committed to a federal type of culture, to federal political culture. But how can we enforce, or how can we develop, or how can we introduce those concepts to a majority nation? Because within majority nation are the most rough obstacles for the development and accepting the federal culture on the state level. So can you please clarify that process? How did you accept in Canada, both in minority and majority part of population, to develop and be committed to the common federal culture? Thank you.
I guess the first way of doing it is to accept, to rub shoulder with each other. So it's quite demanding, because oftentimes people will refuse to rub shoulder with the other communities. Perhaps in the tradition of consociationalism, definitely in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, it has to take place at the political elite level, where you could develop some trust. Probably it will take a lot of time because of the situation that took place, because of the condition in which you find yourself. But you need to be able to find the proper ingredient to, and that could be done through reciprocity. I know in the case of Canada, for instance, because we have francophone minorities in other parts of the country, and Quebec is the hub of francophone community. The larger community of francophones is in Quebec. So what we've done in the past has been to try to encourage, to protect the Anglophone community in Quebec to the extent that the other communities will be able to protect the francophone minorities. So, and we always said that in Quebec, Anglophone community is pretty well secured, it's pretty prosper, although there's been some tension in the history. And in 1976, 77, when the independentists took power, perhaps 100,000 people left Quebec to go to other part of the country. And they said, well, francophone Quebecers are not protecting our rights. We see that our life is may not be as good as it was in the past. And then we decided to develop this reciprocity arrangement, making sure that Anglophone were able to exercise in full the rights. They were able to have access to education in English. And even in Montreal, we have 2 Anglophone universities, 2 Francophone universities. So this did obviously help. And then in other parts of the country now, there are some movement pressing for the establishment of Francophone cegeps or colleges or universities. Although the groups are much smaller, but it remains that is at least some positive gesture. And this has taken time. This reciprocity has taken time. And probably starting with the elites, if trust can be rebuilt, as I said, not blind trust, this will never happen, but conditional trust at the elite level, then I think you can move forward and make some inroads. Otherwise, it will be very difficult.
Thank you, Professor. Any other questions?
Yes. Steve Rukavina, president of the National Federation of Croatian Americans. And as Professor Vanjek and Professor Barbarić know, I've been talking about federalism for a good 3, 4, 5 years with elected officials and diplomats in Washington, D.C. And so, Professor, my question is to you as we discuss the challenges in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and how do you create that functional federalism that protects the rights of minorities and what had been called, constituent nations as part of the Dayton Peace Accord, and yet create a functional, self-sustaining society. And I'm pleased to say, as I've shared with Professor Vanjek and Professor Barbarić, we finally have some so-called Southeastern Europe experts that are talking about federalism. Marko Prelic from the International Crisis Group presented to the European Parliament last Tuesday. Gordon Bardish has done a few interviews to talk about the need for federalism and to get away from a 2-entity structure that the Dayton Peace Accord put the country in. And even Professor Daniel Sirwar, who was involved with the Dayton Peace Accord, who's presenting tomorrow to the House Foreign Affairs Committee right after Secretary of State Adam Albright, is talking about municipalization. Like, we have to get away from 2 entities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So we're building some momentum away from it has to remain 2 entities where Croats are 2nd or 3rd class citizens in one entity or the other. So as we discuss this from a political context, if you have any other thoughts that apply to Bosnia and Herzegovina, because we're dealing with this in Washington, D.C. quite a bit. We'll be doing another webinar in February, and Professor Barbarić was on a webinar we did, 25th anniversary of Dayton Peace Accord with Ambassador Galbraith and Foreign Minister Granic and a few, Zeljana Zovko too. So, Professor, your thoughts about that, and look forward to reading your book, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. There's no simple answer to your question. I am of the view that you need to look at a multiplicity of federal states. The case of, I guess the case of Belgium has something to offer you, where the communities have decided to develop within two large segments, a bit of what you will find in your country. But at the same time, what is lacking seems to be at the elite level. It seems not to be, the trust seems to be less and less present. So, perhaps the notion also that ought to be looked at is the notion of federal citizenship. Oftentimes, the majority nation will use the concept of citizenship to undermine the people, the community themselves. So, but if you were to develop the notion of federal citizenship, then perhaps you could make some inroads within the minority community. Federal citizenship, for instance, in Quebec, we tend to select our own immigrants, and they are officially admitted by the country, but we have the upper hand in terms of selection and in terms of integration of these immigrants. So they may, I think this has to be structured around very specific policy initiative. So is immigration a matter that is very, very crucial to the Croat? I will say probably yes, because of the minority status of the Croat within Bosnia-Herzegovina. So to what extent are they capable of integrating, welcoming, showing up some hospitality toward these other groups that are not necessarily Croat, but they are willing to acquire the language, work into this language, and not be viewed as rival to the Croat themselves, but as member of the larger community that the Croat will become within Bosnia-Herzegovina. So I think first of all, it has to be very practical and policy-oriented, and following that, then probably a federal culture can be developed. At least the traits of a political culture can be developed. Federal spirit doesn't come like this. It has to be built on experiences, has to be built on, you need to have some people with whom you can engage. And oftentimes the other community may not want to engage because they will give you credibility. So you have to find a way, you have to find a neutral forum, a bit like what we find today. We have a neutral forum where you invite a scholars from the, let's say my colleague Tremblay, for instance, and myself, who are going to give you some feedback with respect to other communities. You could invite some German specialists on federalism. People also, there's a lot of specialists in the UK with respect to Scotland, Michael Keating, for instance. And I think through these variety of experiences, you can find a niche for minority nations.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your answer. Other questions? If there are not other questions, I will use. All right, Mr. Fischer. Yeah.
Jonathan Fischer.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hello.
Mr. Fischer, yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much. I just want to first congratulations on the translation of the book. We're also busy here to translate the book into one of the languages in Ethiopia. So if you have any tips on how to do this quickly, would appreciate that. My question to Professor Gagnona and to Alain is, you mentioned about this, the need to value both centripetal and centrifugal forces. And I wonder how that can be done. And I'm thinking of the context, for example, in my country, Ethiopia, where now, as you know, Ethiopia has more or less close to a very multinational federation, a constitution that espouses that kind of arrangement. And with the change that's happening in Ethiopia, there is a feeling that we might need to move away from that. And then the fear that the move might be to the other end. So, and I think possibly the truth might lie in between these two. So how do you manage that? How do you balance both these centripetal and centrifugal forces? And you mentioned this reciprocity arrangement. Probably that could be part of it. And how do you get into that? Do you make is that based on some sort of understanding between the subnational units and the federal government, or is just independent initiative of the subnational units? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Glad that you are with us today. Although I'm very sad to see what's happening in Ethiopia and the violence that has been the situation for the last few weeks. I guess the first thing is to value the concept of asymmetry. We need to accept the fact that perhaps some regions, I guess within Ethiopia, some regions where different communities are grouped, they may have some policy preferences with respect to, it could be agriculture, could be with respect to language training, some very specific public policy. But you don't need to have a wall-to-wall strategy for public policy to implement them. So I'm an advocate of asymmetry. Not that the people ought to view that as a set of privileges, but as a different way to organize a state. And so political asymmetry is probably the way to go forward. And so that, there's not simple answer to your question, but I would say that instead of simply implementing a policy that would be applied to everyone the same way by the central state or by the region state, you probably will need to say, well, perhaps these region states may want to do something in common, some other region state may want to do something together. So perhaps for Tigray as a region, there are many things that they want to do in their own way. But what remains essential is that there is a negotiation on that front. And I guess through constitutional deliberation, but again, you need to be willing to maintain the channel open. And this is not what we've seen. The case of Ethiopia is very particular because there is regions, in fact, nations have the right to self-determine based on the constitution, but what we've seen recently is not quite that. We've seen the central state simply intervening and imposing the rule, almost a martial law, and the Tigrayan being very organized and military structured, have an incredible military force. So they decided to apply their own rules. So we see now a major clash, and it will be very difficult to get out of this conundrum.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Tremblay, you have a question? Or you would like to add something?
I'd just like to add something. With Alain's permission, I'll make a plug for a couple of other things that we've done. So, and I think that this ties into Steve and Dražen's comments. And so the book that we're talking about today is the linchpin, as I mentioned in my comments, of a broader kind of research agenda. And I think Steve and Dražen bring up really kind of very interesting points that I think are addressed in this book, but then also part of that larger research agenda is, and what minority nations in the age of uncertainty really does is establish the desired outcome. Where do you want to go to? How do you want to? But there's a couple of complementary pieces that you might be interested that Professor Gagnona and I have worked on that kind of establish the roadblocks that are there, the impediments to actually achieving this goal. And both of the points that you were bringing up, absolutely right. It's very difficult. I live in a part of Canada, in Western Canada, what we might call here so-called flyover Canada right now, that has a distinct regional identity, but that has a failure to kind of articulate that in relation to federalism. That while there is a keen sense of distinctiveness, there's also a routinized kind of adherence to accepting the legitimacy of centralized structures. So there's this, so it raises the question of how do you shift that political culture? Can it actually change? But just to say, there's two other, there's a short piece that Professor Gagnona and I wrote for John Kincaid's book, Professor Kincaid was here briefly, about establishing the part of these roadblocks to achieving this outcome that is established in minority nations in the age of uncertainty, and also in our most recent book, Federalism and National Diversity in the 21st Century. That's really the objective, is to take the linchpin of this research agenda and more clearly establish what are the obstacles that exist through comparative research as to how to achieve them. So as I said, it's a shameless plug for a couple of other things that we've done together, but I think that they might help to respond to the questions and the concerns that you bring up.
Oh, thanks. And I'll track down that chapter in that book within Jonathan Kincaid's book.
Yeah, it's a research agenda for federalism. Research agenda for federalism. It's Edward Elgar. I believe it's 2019.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Perhaps to add, the concept of legitimacy is, as I said, this is the concept I'm working with now, needs to be taken seriously, because this concept states that the nation or the political subject, in a multinational setting, we have several political subjects. That's a single political subject. We have several political subjects, and these political subjects, whatever the number, be they the 1% of Aboriginal in Quebec or the 14% of Croat within the Bosnia-Herzegovina, these political subjects have the right to self-govern. They have the right to self-govern, and after that, once we assume that, they have also the right to share power with other communities. But we need to found the power at the community level. And then based on the trust we are able to develop, we will share power at a higher level. But first we need to be able to be accountable to our community, to our subnational level, if you prefer that language. And once we have achieved that, then we can trust a higher level to work on our behalf. Not on our behest, but on our behalf. And then if trust is being removed, perhaps we have also to remove the power that has been conveyed or entrusted into the higher level. So here the legitimacy to act will apply to language education, will apply to culture, will apply to immigration, will apply, perhaps we have a discussion in Quebec at the moment on the notion of secularism. Do you want to have a religious or a secular society? This is one of the big challenges of our time. How do we want to act? But definitely the community itself needs to decide what they want and what they want to share. And at one point we realize that perhaps a higher level may intervene, but this will only be done through trust and self-respect for the minority nation themselves, assuming that they are territorially viable. If you find a small group there, but you have to be viable as a community and be able to have schools, be able to have a real structure, municipalities, and so on and so forth, so that you have a government that can live.
Correct.
So I start from the bottom, not from the top, because trust will be based from the bottom, from the basis, from the funding community, And these founding communities will develop trust, and through trust will be able to move forward in a very respectful way. And then federalism as a resonance. We see that, for instance, the case of Switzerland is an important case for your community, because you see there that even immigrant will be welcomed through the canton, for instance. And then the canton will select the immigrants, and they will recognize them, and they will give them citizenship. And then you go at a higher level after that. So obviously the case of Switzerland for your situation is an interesting situation as well.
Correct.
Thank you. I will use or abuse my position of moderator to ask a very concrete question to Professor Gagnon, since you are champion of comparativism and comparative federalist studies, and I'm sure you have experience with active politicians, pro-federalist politicians from countries you covered. You are academic, of course, but I would like to ask you about your impression. Are the pro-federalist politicians in Catalonia and in Scotland, are they aware that federalism is a hot issue in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that we have pretty very active, very sharp debates on these issues, and are they ready to share experiences and or maybe to make interstate, international alliances with federalists from other countries? My questions are related to Scotland and Catalonia only because you have the most experience, and Canada, of course. But it's also related to other countries and other pro-federal political movements and parties.
In the case of Spain, there has been a movement, an important movement within the left. They have advocated federal strategies. So most political parties on the left have been strong advocates of that. Parties at the center and on the right have been very much opposed. I mean, the Bourbonic tradition in Spain has been very strong. Also, the people associated with the Francoist obviously will be entirely opposed to any federal experiment because they feel that the majority nation need to speak on behalf of each and every individual within Spain. So you need to go definitely to the left to see that there's been some movement, there's been some declaration that have been made on their part. There's a fair amount of scholars also within Catalonia because of the unfortunate series of events that has taken place and the intervention of the central state, the police, the military that have inundated the cities at the last referendum. The issue of federalism is very difficult now to promote. People feel, well, it's another trap. It's a trap for that is used by the left to simply bring them into the fold. So it's difficult for them. It's either you are for Spain or you're for secession. In Catalonia, most of the people have a very clear-cut idea about what the future ought to be. So you will probably find these colleagues more in Madrid. Luis Moreno will be one of the person in Madrid, or Juan Romero in Valencia. I'm thinking about Jose Maria Sauca at Getafe near Madrid. So you will find them, but essentially they are left-leaning scholars. Now, the same most countries that have a dominant group tend to be opposed to federalism. I look at the case of countries that have, thinking for instance of Italy, France, Spain, those three, when you use the word federalism, it's normal. Oftentimes it will be viewed as well, you simply are willing to threaten the central state. So federalism is not that popular in France, in Spain, or in Italy. But however, it would be much more important in unitary state, such as the UK, where federalism is more respected in the UK, although it's a unitary state, than it is in the case of Spain, France, Italy. So it depends on the country's foundation. On which principle has it been founded? Was it based on the communities themselves? Or was it based on the principle of the republic or the individual rights? Or what are the operative principle on which a country is being founded? In the case of the UK, it's more the idea of the nation. So you will have the Welsh nation, the Scot nation, the English themselves. So in the case of Spain, it's the Spaniards. And then when we have the new arrangement in 1978 around the communities, well, then there were some historic communities, but shortly thereafter, the central state tried to centralize, develop uniform policies that were uniform, and tried to make sure that no asymmetry existed. In fact, it was a way by which you can re-centralize everything.
Thank you very much. And Professor Vanjek had a question.
Well, just a second. Yeah, it's sort of a question. Last conference we had, there was the comment from the Professor Keel, who we both know. He said that if a majority does not want federalism or openly denies it as an option, then federalism has no chance in such society, which is even bigger problem if that majority neglects federalism in already federal country. So, which is worse situation than, denying federalism in unitary country. Even worse is to have federation with the majority, relative majority, whose elites are openly against federalism, which in a way indirectly they are undermine the very system itself. So it's really challenging situation. On the other hand, there are some papers who claim that federations which staatsfolk, whatever that is, are the most stable, even multinational federations. So it appears to me it's a double game here. Majorities in federations can be both source of stability, but also both source of instability. How do we get the majority, although Bosnian and Herzegovinian constitution does not recognize this specific aspect of majority-minority relations, because this term of constituency simply neutralizes this category. So you are either constituent or not. You cannot be termed as minority, which brings other problems in for some operative problems, how to implement constitution. So in reality, you have majorities and minorities, but you don't have any tool, because the norm is clear. There are no majorities and minorities. So how do we deal with that situation? What the minority, besides affirming its own societal project, promoting federalism, which we have been seeing, it's the case everywhere in the world, the minorities tend to promote federalism. How to get majority elites on board? Besides those unilateral strategies. Clearly, when you speak about federalism in Bosnia and Herzegovina, constitutional framework, its basic elements are in favor of federalism. But what if you have an ethnic group who is relative majority and wants to dismantle that federal arrangement, not to modify it, to accommodate further groups within it, but just to dismantle it? So it's a huge challenge, and something that is a peculiarity of Bosnia and Herzegovina, I would say. So sorry if it's too difficult, and the comment and the question itself.
Yeah, Yeah, well, what to say? Well, definitely you need to have a very high level of democracy to have a federalism. If you don't have a high level of democracy, a highly democratic culture, well, forget it. There's no federalism possible. And most states, even states that are considered to be a model, I look at Switzerland. Switzerland is considered to be a model of the federal tradition in the best way, so to speak. But at the same time, over time, Switzerland and other countries, Canada is another case where federalism is viewed very positively by most countries. But those countries have had a tendency to centralize power over time. So it's not because it's a tendency on the part of majority group to bring power closer to them, so that they don't have to negotiate or to pay much attention to minority communities. So it is the only way to advance the federal principle is to use the international community to pressure, to develop the minority rights as a must for any communities, and at the international level. And in the case of Canada, what has helped, obviously, I would say that is the fact that the two major groups, the Francophone and the Anglophone, have a key role to play within the international organization of the Commonwealth and like Francophonie. And if the Francophone were not, if Canada were not to play a key role within the Francophonie, I'm quite sure that the role of Quebec will be much more weaker. So the fact that Quebec can count on the support of other Francophone countries in the world, France is one example, or even French Africa or Belgium. The fact that we have this international, some international profile, and that we can play a key role. Canada has always wanted to be a role model within the Francophonie, where they have condemned Francophone state in Africa for being not always democratic. So Canada has always heralded its strong democracy as a system to be emulated by other countries. So the same applies, obviously, the role of Canada within the Commonwealth is the same. So in some ways, we are blessed by the gods because we are key members of two major international groups that have a key role economically, culturally. Now, not every community can count on that. The Catalan, for instance, cannot count on that. They wish, although there are 10 million people speaking Catalan in Europe, their language is not even recognized as an official language within Spain. But within Europe, they will be one of the language that is most spoken. So it's probably the fact that they are not connected with other countries that where Catalan is spoken as an official language, or where this group can mobilize interest. So the case of Croatia, I mean, you have some support perhaps from a neighboring state, but at the moment it's viewed as potential enemies and threat. So instead of like the Canadian case, it's not the same. It potentially would bring a stronger economy for Canada to continue the relationship with French Africa, with the Francophone world, whereas Croatia is viewed as well, perhaps here we have some irredentism potentially, and that raised eyebrows on the part of the majority nation.
Thank you. Mr. Rukavina has a question or statement.
Oh, no, my question was asked, so I had raised my hand from that wasn't eliminated or erased, but all very interesting and have some new elements to concepts I'm talking about, and will over the next few weeks and few months quite a bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
So we filled 2 hours with very high quality debate, I dare to say. And thank you very much, Professor Gagnon. Thank you, Professor Vanjek and Barbarić as the main organizers of this event. I hope we will have the opportunity in near future to meet in real space and real time in CFS or some other meeting. But I think this period of COVID pushed us a bit to maybe to put the focus on the content, on the real aspects of the questions we are searching, not to ceremonial one like conferences and traveling abroad. And I am sure that we will somehow succeed to effectuate these experiences. And just to inform you and all others who are not from Bosnia and Herzegovina, we are very rushed last month, let's say a month, because we have 25th anniversary of Dayton Agreement. And I am sure you could find at the web not only pro-federalist and also anti-federalist views. This is the opportunity to not to clash, but to compare these views and to upgrade the debate at the higher theoretical level. What we miss, we really miss. Colleagues from Bosnia and Herzegovina presented you the problems in communication we have in this country, but I'm sure it will be a bit more clearer when our anniversary of the Dayton Agreement is over. Thank you very much again, and see you soon, I hope.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Diana.
Bye. Thank you.
Hope to see you on Mostar.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you very much. Milan, hvala.